Welcome everyone to Eugene City Council work session for May 23rd. We have a major item for our work session, and that's the West Eugene Enterprise Zone. Assistant City Manager?
Yeah, just a reminder that John's out of town today, so I'll be here through the entire evening as his stand-in. And I'll just turn it over to Denny Bro.
So, good evening. Yes, this is a major item, the West Eugene Enterprise Zone. We're here to talk about not only the Enterprise Zone, but the e-commerce zone. It says e-commerce center up there, but it's actually the e-commerce zone. Both of these expire on June 30th this year. And today we're really going to provide the background information. We're not asking any action today. Any questions you have or any additional information that you have or you require, that's really why we're here today. Then we'll come back at a later date for some considerations. So just really quickly, we've talked a little bit about the program a couple of weeks ago relative to Avago, but this is a state program. It basically offers a 3-year property tax exemption for investments made within the zone boundary. We are joint sponsors with Lane County because some of the enterprise zone boundary is outside of the city limits but within the urban growth boundary. So they are required to be a joint sponsor by state statute. The types of companies that qualify are basically manufacturing, processing, distribution, warehousing, basically non-retail, non-financial services. It's really kind of a manufacturing and production-based program. Companies that participate have to increase their employment by at least 10%. They have to maintain an employment increase for the duration of the tax exemption. There are some special cases. We talked about the extended 5-year exemption option when we were talking about Avago a couple weeks ago. There's another special case that allows large investments of over $25 million to receive an employment waiver. That's kind of a rare instance. It's been asked for a couple of times historically, but it's not very common. The Enterprise Zone is a state 10-year designation. Again, ours expires on June 30th, 2016. Another important consideration is there is a grandfathering provision in the Enterprise Zone statute. So even if our zone expires on June 30th, companies that are currently participating in the program can continue to use the program for 10 years after expiration as long as they continue to invest and are continuing to receive a tax exemption in the program. Back before 2005, when we were considering reestablishing our enterprise zone, if you recall, we had an enterprise zone from 85 to 95. We did not have an enterprise zone from 95 to 2005, but as a precursor to establishing the zone in 2005, we established, or council and the county board established, an enterprise zone committee. It was a joint committee with Lane County. There were 2 city councilors, Councilor Charette and Councilor Pryor sat on that, as I recall, and 2 board of commissioners, and then 4 community members, 2 appointed each by each governing body. There's an ordinance that's attached in your packet, Attachment A, which is the ordinance that adopted the public benefit criteria that we currently have in place. And basically the criteria is associated with wages, benefits, supporting small business, redevelopment of existing sites, hiring through local referral agencies, responsible construction, size of investment. Those are the types of things that were captured in the public benefit criteria. And again, this is only applicable to Eugene's enterprise zone. It's specific to our zone. The criteria impacts 25% of the tax exemption, so companies are required basically to repay up to 25% of their tax exemption if some or all of these criteria aren't met. That's basically how it works. There's also another provision in the criteria that caps the enterprise zone exemption per job created, and it caps it at $32,000 per year per job. Most companies get through that without meeting the cap, but the one that recently has was Seneca Sustainable Energy, their cogen plant. Big investment, smaller amount of jobs, and they were actually had to repay a pretty big portion of their tax exemption. I think it was like $217,000 based on them not meeting that cap. Just quickly, the e-commerce zone is an overlay on the enterprise zone. City Council and the Lane County Board of Commissioners established our e-commerce zone in 2012, so it's relatively new. It basically provides a state income tax credit for businesses that are predominantly engaged in business that's done over the internet. It's a tax, state income tax credit, up to 25% of the capital investment made in the e-commerce zone. The maximum credit is $2 million per year. This is a little different than enterprise zone, and there's only 15 e-commerce zones throughout the state. There's 69 enterprise zones, so the e-commerce zone is highly competitive. We actually haven't had any e-commerce investments in our zone yet, but as you'll look at some of the data, we really haven't had that many projects. So finding someone who meets this criteria is it's not straightforward and simple. It's a pretty unique situation, like a data center or someone who's doing a lot of internet-based commerce. This is our West Eugene Enterprise Zone boundary. This is the boundary that was adopted in 2005 and then expanded. I think in around 2010, we added the property in the area for Oakshire and Hutt Valley as part of their expansion plans. So it was a small expansion. This really includes most of the industrial property in West Eugene. If you did an overlay and looked at industrial zone property, it would look a whole lot like this boundary here. Again, there's 69 enterprise zones. This is a map that shows where all the enterprise zones are located throughout the state. The red being urban zones and the blue being non-urban zones, which is a distinction the state makes. Urban zones, for example, can adopt local criteria. That's why we were able to do it. Non-urban zones don't have that ability. There are 7 zones in Lane County: Eugene, Springfield, Florence, Oak Ridge, Cottage Grove, Veneta, and Junction City. So this is a process. There were some questions when we were talking a couple weeks ago about Avago, about qualification, disqualification, and this kind of really tries to outline the process. Companies submit an application, an authorization application, before they make an investment. The city and the county assessor's office jointly approve applications, so they have to go through a review by me and someone at the county assessor's office to make sure they're going to meet all of the state criteria. The investment goes forward. Once their investment's complete, they have to submit a claim form to the county assessor's office, and the county assessor basically reviews that claim, what property was invested, how many jobs were created, who those new people are that were hired, and so forth. And if they meet all the criteria, then the enterprise zone exemption is granted. If not, then they either don't get their first year of exemption, or if they're in their second or third year and they've curtailed employments, they would be disqualified and subject to repayment of taxes. And they have to do that every year. So every year of their tax exemption, they have to submit a claim to show that they still meet the state criteria. And it's a pretty rigorous review that the county assessor treats it like anything else they deal with that's in the state statutes. They also have to do a claim at the end of the year, just show that they meet it. They met all the criteria throughout. The only thing that we do really after the investment is made is monitor the local public benefit criteria. That's the role we play as we go forward. So in your packet, there was some summary of some of the zone activity, or all of the zone activity, basically from 2005 through 15 or present. There were 33 investments made in the enterprise zone. 31 of those were made by local companies, so about 94% of the investments. The entire list of projects that have qualified in the enterprise zone are in attachment B in your packet. About a third of those, interestingly, are local food and beverage companies. This is really a sector that has really taken a stronghold recently, and so I think you'll see that reflected in the companies. One of the things I would note is that Weyerhaeuser was a project we've talked about. They're making a major investment. They're not included on the list. They were asking at one point to pursuing the waiver for that $25 million or more investment, and they've chosen not to apply this past year. So at this point, we're going to assume they're not going to participate. They could qualify a future phase later or something, so I just wanted you to be aware of that. That's really the 33 in 10 years is only 3 or 4 applications a year. It's not really rigorous, but you have to note we're coming out of recession and there really hasn't been a lot of manufacturing investments, with the exception of the food and beverage industry, which has been pretty active. Sorry, I skipped the value of the investments are $516 million, but that included Hynix, and this phase of Hynix is basically the investment that was disqualified. So any jobs associated with Hynix, any investment was actually zeroed out, so to speak, because they had to repay $5.4 million in tax exemption. So really the intent of this analysis here is really to cast Hynix aside and really look at the other activity because they had to repay their tax exemption. So outside of Hynix, about $148 million in investments occurred within the zone over the 10 years, and that average investment is about $4.8 million. As far as the tax exemptions that have been granted in the program, the city's share of the tax exemption has averaged about $268,000. And that amount, really, if the way to look at that is that's the amount that we have invested in the enterprise zone outcomes that are being achieved in the program. The total exemptions granted, again, this is not considering Hynix, is $6.1 million, and the average is about $610,000 per year. As far as the job creation impact, at application, the companies, again, not including Hynix, projected 307 new jobs. The reports that come in with their annual claims, we've verified 524 new jobs that have been created as part of the program. If you look at the average wage in the enterprise zone boundary, looking at employment data, it's about $43,800 per year. And if you attach that to the 524 new jobs, that's an annual payroll impact of about $23 million that have occurred with these projects. And if you use kind of the Ripple multiplier, that's maybe something like $30 to $40 million in local impact that these projects have had in the local community. If you look at our tax exemption, or at least the city's portion of the tax exemption being less than $300,000 a year, and a $30+ million annual income or annual impact, economic impact, that's like 100 times the investment if you consider that tax exemption being an investment. So I think from that standpoint, it's been very successful. The average exemption in the enterprise zone is about $11,650 per job, which is about a third of what we have established in the public benefit criteria. So I think we're doing well in that regards as well. There are 5 pending applications. Avago, of course, is the large one at $400 million. There's a few other, Yogi Tea, Glory Bee, Carte Blanche Caterers, and PacDec. Again, 3 more food companies are included in this list. And there are significant investments, 283 more jobs associated with those pending investments. So this graph here kind of really tells the story of why the enterprise zone discussion, I think, is relevant. Basically, about 8 years have passed since the Great Recession. We haven't yet recovered all the jobs that were lost since the recession. We have about 5,500 fewer jobs than we had at the pre-recession peak. Since 2007, manufacturing jobs have decreased by about 33%, so we've lost about a third of our manufacturing jobs, and these are some of our best paying jobs. Although we've recovered a significant number of those jobs, they are disproportionately in retail and services jobs. So although we've recovered a lot of those jobs, they generally aren't in the manufacturing sector. A lot of them are in the lower paid retail and service industries. The good news is that we're making some headway, especially in the food and beverage industry, the tech sector, for example. The food manufacturing jobs have increased 28%, the beverage manufacturing 112%. So we're selling a lot of beer. I think that's good. The role of the enterprise zone is basically it's a relatively small tool. It's designed to encourage manufacturing investments in the short term. We have the short-term exemption, but the primary goals are really to stabilize the manufacturing base, grow our tax base in the long run, and create good opportunities, good job opportunities for the community. Some examples, of course, are Oakshire Brewing. We helped them establish their new home on Madison Street. They've created a dozen new jobs. They also used our small business loan program. Wildtime Foods, we also helped them relocate and expand in Eugene on West 2nd Street, and they're also a company that's also used our small business loan program. Aurora Investments, they're way out in West Eugene on Enid Road. They manufacture organic soil, organic fertilizers. They distribute products throughout the United States. They currently have 47 employees, and 19 of those are new jobs that have been created recently, and they're growing really fast. Of course, we all know Hot Valley Brewing, again, another major production facility expansion in Eugene. Also a loan recipient in our program. At the last count, there were 26 new jobs, but they're really growing rapidly, and we would expect that number actually to be much larger than that. Rolf Prima, which is a bicycle wheel manufacturer that just recently relocated their facility on Wilson Street. The thing that's really excited about Rolf Prima is they're bringing all of their manufacturing in-house, so a lot of things that used to happen overseas, they're bringing in-house in this new facility. So what they produce will be manufactured in Eugene, which is great. Snow Temp is the final one. We just helped them with a $15 million expansion, refrigerated storage facility. Of course, they play a major role supporting our local food industry, and I think clearly their expansion is directly related to the growth in beverage and food industry in Eugene. So as far as redesignation of the enterprise zone and e-commerce zone, the next steps, we have notified the overlapping tax districts. It's a precursor to applying for an enterprise zone. So that has already occurred. There were no comments. We didn't receive any comments. The city council and county board would need to pass resolution authorizing application to the state. The state application is no longer competitive. Basically, if a community wants an enterprise zone, as many as is wanted is available. So there are now 69, and that's grown a lot recently. Again, the e-commerce zone is competitive. Again, only 15 available. And really on July 1st, we would have to indicate our interest in whether or not we want to pursue that e-commerce zone. That's kind of the state process that's set up. You declare interest and you go through an application process if there's more than one community that's interested. So that's where we are. Again, our intent would be to come back and we're having a similar discussion tomorrow at the Lane County Board of Commissioners, giving all the same background. And then we would come back to have some resolutions considered by both the county and the city.
And is there recent information on how the enterprise zones all over the state have been doing?
You know, we haven't done that yet, but we could definitely work with the state to get some of that information. Historically, we have had one of the most active enterprise zones in the state. I would not say that's most recently. The 85 to 95 enterprise zone, I don't know the exact number, but I recall 10, 12, 15 projects in some year, and now we're looking at 2 to 3 or 4. So activity is definitely down in our enterprise zone. I would say Multnomah County area, Portland area, it's probably a lot more robust, but we haven't done that research.
Be interesting to know actually how things are. Okay, Claire.
Thanks. Thanks, Denny. I was smelling the hops in my neighborhood as I came over here this evening, which I don't normally, but just must have been where the wind was blowing. And just to clarify, I wasn't actually a city councilor at the time that I served on the West Eugene review. I was a citizen appointee. So just a couple of questions, I'll elaborate a little bit. So the public benefit criteria that council developed applies to 25% of the total possible exemption a company might get. And is that just for the base program? It doesn't include if they apply for an extension?
I think that was a question that came up. I'm glad you asked that question because it was a question that came up last. If it applies to every 3-year exemption, yes. The question was last time we talked about Avago was, does it apply to the extra 2 years? It applies to the extra 2 years if council chooses to apply it to the extra 2 years, because you really get the opportunity to put any conditions that you want on the. So after we looked back at the ordinance, it actually says it affects the 3-year tax exemption. It doesn't say 5. And I don't know if that was an oversight or intentional, but the council could choose to apply that or not if the 2 years is granted. So since we have
discretion with the extension, we could apply the public benefit criteria plus other things.
Or some other version of public benefit
Or a
criteria you
tweak.
come up
Okay.
specifically
A
for that
model
2
of-
years. Yeah.
Great. So since the council added that public benefit criteria, in your estimation, did that additional criteria make the program more challenging for companies to qualify for, or interfere with the ability of a company that wanted to get the tax break to do so?
That's a really interesting question. I think it makes a very important value statement about what's important to us in this program and wages and benefits and so forth. But when you pull back a little bit, it's somewhat labor intensive to gather all that data. The repayments, with the exception of Seneca, the repayments, there have only been a few and they're really small. And then they get divided amongst the taxing jurisdictions. So, it may cost us more to gather the data in the long run than anything we get in return, but I do think it's a very important value statement. And as I recall, when the committee worked through this, that was part of the intent. The thing that I think is very important is the cap, because there are cases where a large out-of-the-area company could come here and be eligible by creating one job, and it might be a big, large investment. Seneca's a good example. There were like 11 jobs in a $50 million project, so tax exemption big, job creation impact small. So having that cap in place, I think, has been the most important part of the public benefit criteria, just from a protection standpoint. Companies generally look at it as, well, we're still going to get 75%, and we're probably going to get, have to repay less than 25%. No one's had to repay 25%. So I think it's kind of a thorn in their side, so to speak, because they have to comply and they have to take the time to do it. And if they have to pay it all, it's going to be really small. But I think it is an important statement to make.
Great, I appreciate that. So it sounds like it's a bureaucratic hoop to jump through, for sure. But the criteria that we created are criteria that the companies that wish to apply for this seem to be able to meet.
Yeah, generally most of them do meet it. It does. There are some built-ins that try to bias the small companies, but there are some that are biased against the small companies, like higher wages and full benefits and things that smaller companies have. So it's been good and bad in that regard. There are some points in there for small companies. There's been some challenge with small companies. So a larger company has a better chance of meeting the criteria than a smaller company. And that was not intentional, but that's been a little bit of the outcome.
So then, when we were talking about Avago, I had mentioned that we may want to revisit some of our criteria because, the Affordable Care Act wasn't around when we initiated it. There might be other small or major things that we want to tweak within those public benefit criteria. When would you think that would be appropriate in terms of this renewal for us to look at those?
Because the criteria is local, you could do that any time. It's not attached to redesignation, for example. We could redesignate just like it is now and have the existing criteria and then revamp it over time. You could try to do it now and have it in place on July 1st with the new criteria. So I think that's open as to how you want to approach that.
Good. And then how does the city verify the employment levels and the median wage and the other data points that we are asking them to meet in order to get that extra 25% of their tax break?
Well, as part of their claims that they make, they actually have to submit, property schedules and an employee payroll, basically, that shows who those employees are. And for the county assessor's purposes, I think they even have to have like Social Security number kind of leveled. So it's they have to show that they hired real people. So that part of it, for our public benefit criteria part of it, we send out worksheets that kind of look like doing your tax returns. It has 5 or 6 or 7 pages. You have to go through and fill in the blanks. So we try to help them as much as possible. So they submit it through these worksheets of how many jobs and what's the wage levels and all of that. So.
And then do you have any way of verifying those applications?
The only time we would do it is if we felt like there was a red flag somewhere. Mostly this is small dollar amounts, and if they've gotten enough points to way exceed, there's really no purpose in going back and looking at that. So there's never been a case, at least now, that we thought there was just a justification to go dig in on every, because most of the companies get way more than the 25 points that are in the program.
I see. And then just my last question is if you can just elaborate a little bit on the types of businesses that can apply for the e-commerce zone, because you mentioned them very briefly.
Yeah, it's anyone who predominantly does business over the internet. So you could be selling products over the internet. You could be a data center. And it's really only those investments that you make in equipment, could be computer equipment and so forth, that you use for that e-commerce. So it's a little bit rare. If you were the easiest one is a data center, because those are big, and you could spend hundreds of millions of dollars in a data center. So all of that data center equipment could receive a income tax credit up to $2 million a year. That's kind of how it would work. Those are the clearest examples. If you were just a company and you were selling bicycles over the internet, you could qualify as well, but it's only for that equipment that's used for e-commerce.
I see.
Wouldn't be your production
Not
equipment.
your
for
actual
example. Yeah.
inventory.
So that's why it's a little bit harder. There's kind of unique cases. So.
Great. Thank you.
George Brown?
Thanks, Mayor. So the e-commerce zone, I think I read somewhere that so far nobody has applied successfully for
We've had it
the,
for
state
about
tax
2
credit.
years. Yes, that's
Yeah.
correct.
So, and this is the benefit comes with the state income tax credit. And could an e-commerce business apply to be in the zone and get the state income tax credit? And could they also apply for West Eugene Enterprise Zone tax exemptions
Yes.
on other types
because
of equipment?
those overlap, we would expect that they would. Actually, you need to be in the enterprise zone in order to get the e-commerce benefit.
Okay. And then the enterprise zone, that's the local property tax exemption, but it's a state program. Thinking back to our earlier conversation, it was so if somebody applies and they meet all the criteria, it counts. They don't need council's approval. Is that correct?
For the 3-year
Does it meet the
exemption,
state?
that's correct, yes.
Okay, but they would for the 2-year exemption.
Yes.
And then what about for the e-commerce zone? Would require council's approval?
No. It's just, if you meet the state statutory requirements, you are eligible for the tax credit.
Okay. All right, thank you.
I have Alan, and then Chris, and then George Polling.
I want to make sure I understand this, Denny. So the local criteria allows a property tax exemption for $32,000 per job for the 3-year period, so a total of $96,000. So if they did 100 jobs, it would be $9.6 million.
A lot. It's $3 million tax exemption, yeah.
Okay, I got that. And then, this is a sentence I didn't understand. If the investments exceed the cap, the excess above the cap is repaid to the public. I understand that part. The maximum contribution under the cap is 1/3 of the property tax exemption. State statutes limit the amount of tax exemption that can be recaptured or clawed back to 1/3 of the tax exemption.
Yes.
So, I don't quite get that.
So basically what the state has said is if you adopt, as an urban enterprise zone, if you adopt local criteria, which we have, you can't claw back more than 1/3 of the benefit. So I think they're really trying to remove the possibility that you could say, yes, we're going to give you a tax exemption, but you have to pay back 95% of it. I mean, so they're trying to create some reasonableness around how much can be clawed back.
So if we gave
that's
them
in
a
the
tax,
statutes.
so we gave them a tax exemption for 5 years. That's only 40% more. Then we can only claw back 1/3 instead of saying you didn't meet any of the criteria, so you don't get any of it.
That is correct.
Right. Because the first 3 years, if they meet the criteria, we don't approve it or disapprove it.
It's
just an
theirs by
automatic.
right. That's correct, yes.
Right. Is that why the list of pending applications? We haven't seen any of these. They're all 3-year ones.
Yes, actually, late last
So it'd be
week.
Yogi Tea, Carte Blanche.
Late last week, Yogi Tea, and I was going to mention this, Yogi Tea has indicated that it's interested in pursuing the 2-year extension as well. That application hasn't been approved or pending, but we would have to take that through the same process as Avago. It'd have to come to county and the city and county. Yes.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. So it's only when they do the extra 2 years that we get involved.
Yes.
And they have to meet the local criteria. I will point out the list on page 12. If you take out Hynix, it's all small businesses. Assuming that projected job creation, is that the incremental job creation or the total job creation for the firm?
That is the job creation that they projected in their
For that-
application when they
for that
submitted.
investment.
And again, most have exceeded it. So
Yeah, most of them are in the teens, some are in the 20s, and Ninkasi is the high one in there. It's 60 and 40 for Lance Cabinets, but it's mostly almost all small businesses.
Yes.
That have created this benefit from this exemption. I was going to ask why where's the list for the e-commerce, but I got that answer if there isn't one. And then I thought that the graph, a couple of slides back on the employment graph, it looks like the line graph. It looks like a buzz employment. Is it that seasonal? Is that what's causing that weird shape?
no, well, probably the buzz, the teeth, so to speak, is
Yeah.
probably seasonality, and there's a lot of seasonality in agriculture, even in schools, university, I assume. So that would be my best guess, but I don't know that for sure.
Okay. And go back 3 more slides, or no, 2 more slides. That one. Those estimated local payroll impacts, that $23 million per year.
Annual, yes.
Yeah, that's annual.
Yes, sorry.
Okay. So, and that average exemption per job created is an annual number too.
That's correct.
Right. Okay. Thanks. That was needed to clarify. I was hoping this was going to be a show and tell kind of thing, but you didn't come up with any of the products. So.
Lots of good food and beer.
Thank you, Alan.
That's it. Thanks.
Chris?
Thank you. This is really helpful, and since a lot of these businesses and the ones we're talking about are located in my ward, and some of them overlap into Councillor Evans' ward, this is a very high interest to me, not only for my ward but also for the community. And so I want to leap ahead to the results. What's the payoff? You do all this because you're going to get some sort of a payoff, and I think there's kind of 3 areas based on your presentation, what we've been talking about, where the payoff is most apparent. One of them is the payoff in terms of economic development. We've been talking about economic development as long as I've lived here, more than 40 years probably. And economic development has never only solely been measured by tax revenue. It's been measured by the things we've talked about, employment, a whole host of things. And so based on the kinds of factors in terms of employment and payroll and the rollover effect and all that others, it really, as you've pointed out, far exceeds anything that we have ever invested in terms of property tax forbearance. I mean, we in other words, the money we put in, we get way back. Which is the second one, the money, the money element. If you're going to put money into something, you want to get more back than you put in. Based on this presentation, I think that's very clear. That whatever we've put in, we've gotten many, I think you said 100. I don't know if that's really true enough. But even if it was half of that, I'd still go for 50. I still think that's pretty good. And then the last one to talk about is to focus in on the employment piece. And as the Buzzsaw chart showed, at one time this area was very robust in terms of manufacturing jobs, which were high-paid jobs, good benefits, very consistent, very reliable. And we've, through not just one recession, but through a number of recessions, have had a significant loss of those good, stable manufacturing jobs in favor of lower-paid service kinds of jobs. I mean, for some folks a job is a job, but what we're looking looking for in terms of the results, the payoff, is a good job, a quality job. And so I'm particularly interested, as we talk about economic development, in pursuing targeted industries that result in good, high-paying, good benefit manufacturing jobs in sectors that we want. Not polluting, nasty, smokestack sectors, but good sectors. And food is one we've targeted, and electronics and semiconductors is another. So I think for those three reasons, we're looking at an economic development opportunity that fits the results we've been looking for decades. With a relatively minimal investment, even if we added the 2 years, because I thought the criteria was a good idea. And I actually support Claire's notion that the last time we did this was 2005. Might not hurt to do a little bit of reviewing, just to tweak, make sure everything's okay. But still, I think this looks like it's satisfying everything we've wanted.
George Foley?
Thank you. Yeah, Alan and Chris had mentioned some of the things that I was going to say. In reference to Alan's comments about the list of companies that have taken part in this, they are small companies that owned and operated by local people that have decided to stay and invest in the community, and it's obviously this has helped to expand and retain these companies. The percentage of the local companies that took advantage of this is real similar to the percentage that when my wife was working for the Metro Partnership in Economic Development. It's the same percentage of dealing with local companies as opposed to somebody coming in. So it's obviously following the trend. I agree, Claire, maybe it is time we revisit some of the local criteria, but we need to be careful that we're consistent and predictable on what we do with that and not change in the middle of a process somewhere. And I agree with Chris that the investment that we've made, which is a little over $300,000 a year, compared to the $30 million plus of to the impact of the local economy, is well worth the investments that we're making. And then finally, on the e-commerce zone, granted we haven't had anybody apply to use it, but it is very competitive to get one of those throughout the entire state. And my question is, why would we want to give away a tool, even though it hasn't been used yet, but why would we want to give up the opportunity of having that tool in our toolbox if the occasion ever arises?
Betty?
Thank you. First, a question. Would a call center qualify for e-commerce zone?
Yes.
Well, that would be very low wage jobs.
Depends, but some of them are, yes.
Okay. I wouldn't think we'd want to give tax exemptions for that. But when you talk about average wage, are you including benefits?
For this purpose, I had mentioned the average wage within the enterprise zone boundary, and that's just wages, and that comes from the employment department. That's just the wages.
Just the salary. And average, of course, could include some very low wages. Is there a bottom wage that qualifies them?
There's no wage requirement in the enterprise zone program. The state doesn't provide you have to pay a certain wage. We have some local criteria, as we've mentioned, that have some benefits for companies better benefits for companies that pay well.
They get a bonus for average wage, but that could be averaging the highest wages, obviously.
The average is based on the Lane County average. That's what we use.
Okay, thank you.
Alan?
Yeah, on the competitiveness, Danny, so the e-commerce one is a competitive application process, and there's only 15 in the entire state. We were fortunate to get one of them, and that was 2 years ago. So the fact that we had no applicants, is that going to hurt our chances of
It could. I
applying,
think.
or is there an auto
Yeah, it's a good question.
renewal program?
When we applied last time, there was actually pretty strong interest from a data center, and part of your application you need to show that there is interest from for a particular investment. So How competitively we will be, we have had some conversations with data centers, smaller than what was talked about previously. So there is some ongoing data center kind of interest in investing in Eugene. So, but yeah, I think it's going to be tougher this time around. My understanding from the state is there's a lot of interest in our e-commerce zone because it's the one that's expiring, and it's the only one.
That's the only one that's expiring?
It's the only one that will be available.
Okay.
So everyone will be competing for one. Anyone else who wants an enterprise zone will be competing for our
Commerce.
zone. But, yeah, I'm sorry, commerce. I'm sorry.
Our e-commerce one, yeah.
Yes.
The other one's not competitive.
No, sorry.
You just apply
Yes.
and get it, right, because it's state law. So how come ours is the only one that's
Because our zone is
expired?
of the 15 e-commerce zones, we're the only one that has an enterprise zone that's expiring this year.
Oh, so it's, we're just
It's
lucky.
kind of weird. Yeah. Which was a surprise. We thought the e-commerce designation was going to be
Yeah,
for 10
for
years.
10
but
years.
We were notified earlier this year that when our zone expires, the e-commerce will become available, and that was a little bit of a surprise, actually.
Yeah, well, maybe that will play in our favor, that the rest of them are going to go for a full 10 years in our, or thereabouts. And ours is so short that we really didn't get to pick up off the ground.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
I wanted to just make a comment that, in keeping with what George said, that state economists really do point out that the biggest bang we get in our economy is with our local businesses and enabling them to grow, because they are here to stay. So that's a good thing. And I think maybe we need a motion to restart up a committee to look at our criteria.
Do we need to do that? If you would like to do that tonight and start that up, if you're anticipating trying to get through that committee and get through what updates you might want to make, and before you keep the zone in place or don't keep the zone in place. Otherwise, you could, if I was understanding correctly, that committee could be working concurrently, and we could update our local benefit criteria from what it is now at any time going forward.
That's correct. And if you recall, well, maybe you don't, but last time the zone was effective July 1st, 2005, and we were into 2006 before we adopted this criteria, and I think we had some interim criteria. So you would have time to do it. The only thing you should be aware of is on July 1st, if we applied, it would just be subject to the criteria we have in place now, which has worked for 10 years, so I assume it would continue to work.
But well, this is up to the council, but it does seem to me that it's been going on for a while. We've been using it. It's probably a good time to assess it. Why not assess it when you're at this pivotal point? So
Sure.
It's up to you guys if you want to do that, but they need to have some direction if you want to.
My only point in what I was trying to clarify was the only reason you would need to do that motion tonight, I think, would be is if you wanted to try to get that work in before you update it. Otherwise, when we come back for our next work session, we can do it at that time, too.
Alan?
So when is the next work session on this? Because it's June 30th
Yeah.
it expires.
Yeah, I don't think it's scheduled at this point. I think,
Before June 30th, hopefully.
yes, it will be, sometime in June.
So it's getting through all that criteria in that time frame is
Yes.
very unlikely.
Might be difficult.
Yeah, or more like possible.
Yeah. But I think you can signal your desire to do that and put the committee in place. You could do that now, or you could do
Or you
it
do
at your
it
next work
when
session.
it comes back,
Yeah.
which will be within the
Correct.
next month or so. Okay.
And I've got George Pulley and Chris.
Yeah, once
And,
again,
right.
Alan has made the comment that I was going to make, that with short time frame to get this application in for the enterprise zone, we want to make sure that we thoroughly review and update, if necessary, the criteria, and I think we'd be pushed to get it done right. So I'm okay with starting that committee now and working on it, but not put a deadline on getting it done the same time we resubmit for new enterprise zone.
Chris?
Yeah, I would probably say that Claire and I did superior work back in 2005. So I'm not feeling a lot of enormous pressure to make a lot of changes, but it's due for some review. But I don't feel the pressure to do it, rush and something like that.
Well, if you guys are on, it'll be a short committee.
But the question I did have, something you mentioned about the enterprise zone being due to expire, and so I've been making the assumption all along that we are reapplying for a renewal of the enterprise zone. Is that indeed the case?
Our intent would be to bring back a resolution which would authorize the city manager to reapply. And really, because it's now an open process, it used to be they were competitive, so on
Right.
July 1st, if you didn't apply, someone else was going to take your zone. Technically, you could apply 6 months from now. It just means we wouldn't have an enterprise zone for 6 months, but we already have the criteria in place, and so we're working under the assumption that if we reapply, we would try to get the new enterprise zone redesignated by July 1st so that it's seamless and the program would continue.
Yeah, and I think that's what I would want to encourage. I don't think there's really a practical reason to have a gap between having and one and not having
it
one.
It would foreclose out your opportunity to have the e-commerce zone.
Which is that other real good reason I was going to come to. So I would encourage, and I don't know whether you need a motion now or maybe you don't need a motion, but I think we should move with all due speed to get the enterprise zone renewed so that, one, we don't have any gaps in being able to provide, and two, it doesn't jeopardize our e-commerce zone, which is competitive and which we did go to a lot of work to get, and it would seem kind of not productive to just kind of let it disappear. So from that standpoint, as another conversation, I think we just need to move full speed ahead with that and make sure it happens in a timely fashion.
So my understanding is you didn't need a motion tonight for it. You're going to bring
Well, the state requires you to pass a resolution authorizing the city manager to apply, so we will come back with that because you have to take action.
Okay, and I would just encourage to do that as quickly as you need to do it. Thank you.
Greg?
Denny, is the 25% payback provision, is that local statute or is that by state statute, one? And then two, is that, flexible? I mean, we go up to 35% or it goes down to 20%?
It's local. It's in an ordinance. You have a copy of the
Yes.
ordinance, so
Okay.
that's what authorizes the criteria is that ordinance. So it is definitely local. Councilor Zelenka mentioned the 1/3. That's the maximum. So I don't remember why through the committee work it came up with 25% instead of 33%, but you could claw back up to a third of that benefit by state statute.
Okay, so there is a state statute
On how much you
cap.
can return,
Okay.
so to speak, yes.
Blair?
Alan's asking me to remember the work we did 10 years ago. There was definitely some compromise around the table as we worked on those public benefit criteria, as is always the case when we create policy. So I would like to just say I appreciate the comments about looking at that public benefit criteria. I agree that we wouldn't want to try to rush to do that by June 30th. There doesn't seem to be the imperative to do that. So what I'd like to request, and I can make a motion if needed. So I would move that move to ask city staff to prepare an outline of a process for updating the public benefit criteria to present to council when you bring back the enterprise zone for renewal.
Second?
Second.
Moved and seconded? No further discussion? Yes.
I just want to make it clear that the county is a joint sponsor, so any work that we do around public benefit criteria should and will include the county. That's why it was a joint committee. So I'm talking to the county commissioners tomorrow, so we can share our interest in pushing forward with some committee work and ask for their concurrence on that. So.
I'd also really like it if we talked about that, about doing due diligence and really trying to live up to the expectations that we think the community would have of us, because they've had a lot of interest in Enterprise Zone, and they would want to know that we were exercising good oversight over what happens with it. So however you frame it like that, I want to, because I think that they'll feel the same way. So that would be my suggestion, yes.
Well, clarifying things. So in the ordinance, it said that the local criteria are in Appendix A, Exhibit A, attached to the ordinance. Is that This?
Yes.
Oh, okay. This is not labeled. Oh, yeah, it's right at the bottom. Sorry, missed that.
Okay, ready to vote on this? All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in favor, none in opposition. It passes. Thank you. And thank you, Denny.
Thank you.
And next up are committee reports and items of interest. And Councilor Zoll, do you have anything?
No.
I don't have a committee reports because unfortunately I had to miss my recent committee meetings, but I should share, I did not have the chance to do this, that I've been invited to participate and have started to participate on a state legislative work group on diesel emission reductions for the state that was convened by Senator Chris Edwards, and I'm there representing cities of the South Valley.
Great.
I don't have anything.
Okay. George?
I'll pass.
Chris?
Just that the Human Rights Commission met last week, and one of the topics of conversation at that meeting was about the resolution that Claire's going to bring later on at the 7:30 meeting. And so there may be some folks who want to speak to that, but they were very appreciative that we're bringing that forward.
Mike?
No, thank you, Mayor.
Okay. Betty?
Thank you. Just one thing. A lot of happy people on Fox Hollow Road because of repairs which make it easier for bicyclists. And I've seen many emails saying thank you.
Greg?
I have nothing at this time, Mayor.
Alan?
Claire prompted me to remember that I'm also on a statewide LCDC task force to help look at and establish legislation potentially for metropolitan-wide MPC area greenhouse gas reduction targets for the state on transportation. And then I'll just shout out to the Sheldon track team who won the state championship.
Shout out to them.
Good job.
Yes.
Good job.
I guess I could tell you that I attended our Poverty and Homeless Board meeting last week, and I attended a meeting with a fellow Mark Jolin, who heads up that issue in the Portland area, talking about some of the things that they're doing there. And then, so the work on that possible Housing First project goes on with great effort. And on Friday, I attended the treatment court commencement of 4 people graduating from the treatment program. So that's always a great thing. And anybody else? Okay. And then I think Mark is going to talk to us about the quiet zone, right?
Right. We'll give you an update on where we are with the railroad quiet zone. So it was in March of 2015 that the council gave staff direction to pursue a railroad quiet zone and local fundings to implement a quiet zone. And the first phase, and it was really about a citywide quiet zone, but the first phase was the 10 crossings downtown between 8th and Hilliard to Van Buren. And these 10 crossings carry both their own. It's owned by Union Pacific, the rail line, and it's used by Union Pacific and Amtrak, and carries 19 to 23 trains a day, and has about 90% of the routine train horns sounded in the city limits. In addition to the quiet zone, we're trying to coordinate 3 railroad projects on the UP line. A second project is at the Amtrak station. ODOT Rail and Amtrak are working to expand the platform and also build a stub tracks or siding so that Amtrak trains can overnight. And that siding would require the closure of either Lincoln or Lawrence for the switching of tracks. And then the third project is the relocation of 8th and Hilliard to better align with 8th in the project of the Willamette to Willamette project and the development of the eWeb property. So those 3 projects we're coordinating all 3 as we move forward. The quiet zone is a federal process with prescriptive rules outlined in federal regulations, including what safety measures can be used at the different crossings. And the safety measures could include quad gates. So each of our crossings have 2 gates now. Quad gates would just double the number to 4, so it would block all lanes of traffic. closure of a crossing, conversion of a crossing to a one-way street, or in some cases, medians can be used if there's, but they're limited by if there's proximity to driveways or other intersections. That restricts the use of where medians can be used. Another requirement is forming a diagnostic review team, and that includes Union Pacific as the owner of the railroad, ODOT Rail as the state regulatory authority, and they issue the crossing orders for new crossings or changes to crossing. And then the Federal Rail Administration as the agency that would approve a quiet zone. And then the city as the road authority and the person that would, or the entity that would pay the capital and operating costs for any improvements. And so this diagnostic review team met last summer, and really the purpose of that was to go to each crossing and with that group decide what measures were possible at the different crossings. So we did that, and then we convened a citizen panel with 11 members. The charge of the panel was similar to the staff, which was let's recommend safety measures at each of the crossings and recommend the funding strategy. And the representation on that was businesses from both the east and west end of the 10 crossings, the downtown and Whitaker neighborhood associations, people with disabilities, the Chamber of Commerce, residents adjacent to the crossings, and that included a representative from the Poa Terrace, and then residents at large, and finally the representative from Bike and Ped community. And that group has met 6 times, and we went over stuff from just basically what is a railroad quiet zone and what's the federal process. What did we learn with our regulatory partners in terms of what's possible at each crossing. They did a field trip to the different crossings. They came up with a preliminary recommendation on safety measures. They looked at additional safety measures, which beyond a quiet zone for example, there's a lot of gaps in the fencing and there's a lot of trespass in the road, and the concern was, well, if you successfully implement a quiet zone but there's trespassers, the engineers are going to sound their horns anyway. So they looked at closing about 7,000 lineal feet of gaps in the fencing. They also looked at ped crossing gates at Monroe and High Street, because there's a crash history of peds and bikes at those locations, and they're both high use for peds and bikes. And then they looked at new funding options. One would be a new funding option, such as a bond measure. Existing resources was a second option, which would include the general fund, a riverfront urban renewal, local gas tax, the ped bike element of the street bond measure. And so all those existing sources would require giving up a project or a program to fund the quiet zone. And then finally, it was a combination of either a new and existing. So that would be a bond measure for some of the crossings and riverfront urban renewal money for the remainder. And then finally, after developing a preliminary recommendation, we did a more intense public outreach, and then the last meeting of the panel was to come up with a final recommendation. So our public outreach, and really the goal was to not only engage the community, but to inform the citizen panel of what the community views were on the quiet zone, because each of those panel members represented a distinct group, and they brought that input back, but then they heard from the staff and from each other about what the community was thinking about the quiet zone. And so we had a website, media outreach, we had community meetings at both Whitaker and Poa Terrace and downtown neighbors and others. We had an open house, and then we did individual outreach to businesses that were adjacent to the different crossings. And we had a survey, which was non-scientific, but it was a survey both written and online to get additional input. And so the recommendation that the committee came up with for safety measures were quad gates. So this is 4 gates at Monroe, Madison, Washington, Pearl High, and then 8th and Hilliard. A one-way conversion of Jefferson southbound. And this was really the only viable option at that location, because if you're familiar with that area, grain millers have an active siding. And so with that active siding, the only way to be vehicles from being able to get around the whatever safety measure in place was to make it a southbound, and then close and then have gates on the on the north side of that intersection. And then, medians worked at Lawrence and Van Buren, and then a closure of Lincoln Street. And then the additional pedestrian and bike measures were the fencing and then ped crossing grates at Monroe and High. And so the changes between what the preliminary recommendation was and what the final recommendation was, and what happened in intervening was the public outreach with going to the different communities, and then the open house, was that at Van Buren we had two options. We had either quad gates or medians, and with the medians there'd be a loss of 2 parking spaces, and because in the Whitaker parking has become an issue of late, there was concern about losing any parking, but the cost of the quad gates was substantially more than the medians. So after the public outreach, the committee landed on medians for Van Buren, and then the other issue was the closing of Lincoln or Lawrence. And initially, in the preliminary recommendation, we went with Lawrence, but we heard a lot more from the businesses affected by the closure of Lawrence. We did more additional traffic counts and found that Lawrence actually carries more traffic and more truck traffic delivering to the businesses than Lincoln does. And then there's some uncertainty whether, from ODOT's engineers, whether Lawrence would actually work for the improvements at the Amtrak station. So for those reasons, our committee went back to closing Lincoln. And then the one from the public outreach, meeting with the Emerald chapter of the Council of the Blind, they recommended additional pedestrian crossing arms at Washington and Pearl Streets because they're transit routes, and a lot of visually impaired people use transit to get around. But our committee, and those would be another $200,000 each. The committee was split on that, with the majority not recommending to go forward with that, with the belief that they could be added in the future if they were needed. And so this total cost of this package is roughly $7 million. And of the 3 funding measures, funding it with existing resources, funding it with the new resources with bond measure, or funding it with a combination, the committee landed on, and again with some not complete agreement, but funding using the Riverfront Urban Renewal District and a bond measure to fund the implementation of the quiet zone. And so the next steps are, with our committee, is we put together a report of all the work that's been done to date. We're going to be completing a triple bottom line analysis that looks at the economic, social, and environmental impacts of establishing a quiet zone. We'll share that with our citizen panel, and if need be, we'll reschedule another meeting with them to kind of walk through any issues with the report or the triple bottom line analysis. And then we'll come back to the council in July for a work session and share the report and the triple bottom line analysis with the council. Then, assuming there's a decision to move forward, then we'd have to negotiate with Union Pacific for design and construction agreements. The design, procurement, and construction process would generally last about 3 years, so it's a significant amount of time once we get going. And then after construction, you can do the formal application to the Federal Railroad Administration for a quiet zone. So some of the things that we've learned through this process is that the quiet zone itself does not require any closure of crossings. It's the Amtrak station improvements and the relocation of 8th and Hilliard that are driving closure. The survey that we did, though it's not scientific, the community was fairly evenly split on whether or not we should even move forward with the quiet zone. There's enough distance, when we got into the details of it, there's enough distance between Pearl and Lincoln that we could actually have 2 separate phases to the quiet zone. So I think it's a minimum of a quarter-mile distance between crossings, and there's enough distance so that we could move forward with one phase earlier than the other. at Pearl and High, even though they're outside the urban renewal district, because of the impact to the urban renewal district, they could be funded with riverfront urban renewal money, but it would require a modification to, or an amendment to the plan, not the boundary, but the plan itself. The Whitaker Community Council is extremely concerned about the effect a quiet zone would have on property values and rents. And their concern is that both would go up. And they shared with us that 82% of their residents are renters. And then there was also interest through the public process from Santa Clara area for the quiet zone to include Irving and Irvington, which are both outside of the city limits and under the jurisdiction of Lane County. So that's kind of a quick update of where we're at.
Very thorough. Are we going to get copies of that?
Of the report?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So I've got Claire and then Alan.
Yeah, thank you for the update. I really appreciate it, and for the work and the work of the citizen panel and the outreach. And I guess I'll recognizing that some of the folks who serve on the Whitaker Community Council are oppose the quiet zone. I'll just remind us that the Downtown Neighborhood Association took a formal vote asking us to create one with all due haste. So we do have some differences of opinion out there. So if I understood you correctly, the closure of the one crossing would eventually happen regardless of whether we pursued a quiet zone or not. Is that your understanding from
Right.
Union Pacific?
Right.
Okay. And then I'm very pleased to hear that we're going to do a triple bottom line analysis on this. I had asked for that, partly because of the concerns raised by folks in Whitaker about the potential impact on property values. So I'm hoping that you will look at whether or not other quiet zones that have been established in Oregon have, what kind of impact they've had on surrounding property values and other impacts, as well as the health benefits or impacts of establishing the quiet zone, which for me is the overriding motivation for creating one in the first place. So thank you.
Alan and then Chris.
Yeah, I agree that the quiet zone is a citywide benefit because you can hear them everywhere, and it makes sense to break it up into parts. Since starting somewhere makes sense, and the downtown section, because of the urban renewal district, makes the most sense because you can jumpstart it with some money. And so $7 million for those 10
That's right.
sites. And how does that split between the riverfront urban renewal district and, say, putting it into the road bond?
I think it was
2
3.
and 5, or?
I think it was like 3, because the relocation of 8th and Hilliard is the most expensive. It seemed to me it was a little over 3 for the urban renewal.
3 and 4. So you could accomplish that first leg by adding $4 million to the next road bond, for instance. When is that next road bond up?
Fall of 2017.
That's when it goes back out to the voters?
Right, right.
Fall of 2017, okay. So this is timely for that, add to that.
And then, well, just to add, there was, and we did talk a little bit about that with the street repair review panel this past fall when that group met, and there's not support among that group to tie the quiet zone to the street repair bond because they're focused on street repair and don't want to risk losing
I
that.
understand that.
Yeah, I can see that. So 19 to 23 trains a day, is that what you said?
Yes.
So say 20 trains a day, and they have to blow their horn at each one of the 10, that's 200 blasts a day. And if they did it 5 days a week, that's 50,000 horn blasts a year.
I haven't done the math, but I'll trust you.
Yeah, 260 days times 200. Wow. Yeah, when you think about it like that, and then you divide by the $7 million divided by 50,000 times 20 years, the cost per blast is really actually pretty cheap.
I think they blast like 3 times at each crossing.
And they do.
There's a
So
set.
that's
So
$150,000.
it's almost free. Now, I'll just reiterate, thank you for the TBL analysis that's coming up. I'm eager to see it as well. And I agree with what Claire said, especially I think the part of TBLs that gets always short shrifted is the social aspects of it. And the economic and the environmental seem to readily flow because we're used to doing those things. But the social ones, in particular, the health benefits associated with them are under analyzed. So I hope you'll pay particular attention to those aspects of that triple bottom line. But I'm glad you do that, and I'm eager to see that.
Well, and to be clear, it'll be a fairly qualitative analysis. I mean, we've looked a little bit for there's very little research that we found on the economic impact on, say, on property values and rents from quiet zone implementation. So it's going to be more. I think our idea is to, for using the city's tool is you're trying to identify all the issues and have all the conversations. But it's not going to end up with, this is the right solution. It's really more that you're making an informed decision.
Yeah, and the economic impacts, I think, would be hard to determine because it's the proximity to the train. Thanks for not saying close proximity, by the way. Proximity to the train that actually would be the impact, and the horns is only one part of that. The other part is this big, giant, noisy thing going through your backyard. Having had a friend who lived half a block from the trains, after a while, he didn't even hear it, but to me that was cool. But I guess you get used to anything.
Chris?
Thank you. This is interesting, and it raises, I think, a larger question that really, I think, is an important one for us to talk about. The railroad quiet zone has direct and indirect consequences, and we're talking a lot about the direct consequences with regard to noise and so forth and so on. But you did bring up a potential indirect consequence, which is as a result of putting in a quiet zone, suddenly property values and rents and things go up, which isn't a direct consequence of the quiet zone, but it could be a follow-on effect. And I think it gets back to the question we've been talking about of, does gentrification represent a bad occurrence within neighborhoods? Can it be destructive? And I've read both ways. That gentrification is something that frightens a lot of people because in some areas gentrification has been done in such a way that it has forced out the traditional residents of an area. And does that have to be the follow-on consequence of gentrification? And I think that's the larger question that we perhaps should wrestle with, because we're moving more towards, rather than further away, from gentrification within the Whitaker neighborhood. And I don't think we can ignore it. It's, in whatever form, even if there is or isn't a quiet zone, other forms of gentrification are occurring there. And I think we need to have a conversation about whether or not improvement can occur within any neighborhood in such a way that it somehow disrupts or eliminates the ability for folks, whether you want to call it workforce housing or lower income or whatever you want to call it, can no longer afford to live there. And in other words, are we driving regular working class folks out of neighborhoods through gentrification, which has occurred in other cities? So while I'm interested in the quiet zone's impact on gentrification, I think it's a larger question that we should schedule some time around, because the Housing Policy Board is actively looking to purchase properties within the Whitaker that they can improve so you have a nicer quality of living there, but at a lower rent level, so that you can maintain the ability for people of modest incomes to still continue to live there and not be driven out by gentrification. And perhaps there are strategies we can use to improve an area that don't have to lead to driving out the lower income population or the people that naturally live there. I mean, I can understand the desire to keep it kind of inexpensive and funky. I don't want to get rid of inexpensive or funky in the Whitaker. But at the same time, I don't think that has to translate to dirty, disheveled, disrepair, not in good shape. I think anybody deserves to live in a nicer place, but not so nice that it drives them out of their neighborhood. So I'm just saying, we need to have a larger conversation about what the implications are of gentrification and how it can be done in a way that is not only supportive to the goals of development, but is not at the expense of the neighborhood, and explore ways to maybe accomplish that.
I so appreciate you bringing speaking to that, Chris, because I do think that is the issue in the neighborhood. It is true that the quiet zone is bringing that issue forward, but we're already feeling it over many things happening in that neighborhood, and so how can we assist with that, I think, is a really important question, and really everybody cares about it everywhere I go right now. And I also want to say that, I got you, Greg, that where I live, a couple blocks from the tracks, I don't hear it very much because the sound goes up. People who are in other places hear it much louder than I hear it. So it is, proximity is an interesting thing. It's the way the sound travels. And I also wanted to say, I hope you sort of think about including the Sustainability Commission and the Human Rights Commission in the conversation around this. That these are some big issues that they can help us pull out some of the things we should be thinking about. I'm going to go to Greg first because he hasn't had a round, and then I'll go to you, Claire.
Just kind of the back end of the napkin analysis, what do you know offhand what the effect of the quiet zone implementation in Salem was, specifically around property values or, changes in the neighborhood?
No, I don't. I mean, I can certainly follow up. We've at the start of this process, we met with the Salem staff to learn more about the federal process, but we could certainly follow up if they've done any work on the economic impacts.
And if there's any other, analysis, I know that, Northeast Portland is not that far from railroad crossings and that kind of situation, and they've had significant issues around gentrification to the point where certain populations have been driven out of Northeast Portland, and housing values have skyrocketed, where we've had some people who sold their homes that they've been in for many, many years for, a song and a dance, and then come back and they're worth several $100,000 when someone else goes in, buys them up, and reinvests in the property, in the residential property as well as the commercial property. So both of those things have taken place in the Northeast Portland example. And I'm wondering how that happened, if any of that happened in Salem, and could it be instructive for us to avoid some of those things that Councilor Pryor was just talking about, as far as, losing the character of the neighborhood, and more specifically, the affordable housing that is in that neighborhood.
Claire?
So we do have a work session scheduled on renter protections that I asked for, largely in response to the concerns I heard from folks in Whitaker about this quiet zone proposal, although it's something we should be talking about even if we weren't thinking about this quiet zone. So, and that's definitely around what are the tools or policies that this council could implement or utilize to provide for folks staying in those moderately lower-priced, affordable rentals and still enjoy a good quality of life. I don't think we should have to give up neighborhood livability in order to stay in our homes, and I see silencing the trains as increasing neighborhood livability for a long section of the tracks as well as miles around. Because a lot of folks who have an interest in this don't live along the tracks, but I do know that folks who live along the tracks are actually supportive, many of them. I do want to raise a caution around the phasing conversation. I understand the motivation around it to move cautiously and, recognizing, revenue challenges, but I'm already getting emails from folks who live further out on Irving and Irvington who are saying, why aren't you including us in this quiet zone? We want to be included. And I recall when we had our conversation around banning fireworks, and we banned them in one part of town, and many people in other parts of the town were very angry at us for not taking their safety as seriously as we took the safety of the South Hills. And I know that wasn't our intention, and it wouldn't be our intention if we decided to phase this in, but I just think we need to be very mindful of how it appears to people when we do something we may be knowing we're doing it in phases, but the rest of the public doesn't necessarily know that, and they feel like they're being left out or ignored. Someone else is a higher priority than they are. So I just think that's important for us to keep in mind.
Alan?
Yeah, and I agree with that. I'm also wondering about whether this plan that's being brought forward is the least cost plan to address the quiet zone. Some folks have mentioned the downblast local horns that aren't heard all over the place and that are much cheaper, but I understand that they're not that effective, and the railroads don't really consider them the equivalent of a quad gate. And so is this just that, and whether or not this is the least cost plan to get us there?
Well, the citizens panel did, I think, twice brought up the issue of wayside horns, and they're quieter in terms of that they're directed at the crossing and they're not directed, to the whole surrounding area. But it does, so a little bit less expensive. They're not as quiet, and it also requires the city to take on the ownership, operation, and maintenance of it, and we'd have to have our maintenance crews certified to do that type of work. So the panel considered it, but did not want to go forward with it. And I mean, the closing of crossings is the most economical and cheapest, but there's not a large appetite for closing any crossings.
All those streets.
And medians are probably the next cheapest, and we've placed medians at every of the crossings that could technically meet the criteria for medians.
And medians close off people's access.
Right. And the whole idea is to make it as safer than train horns, and you're trying to prevent people from driving around the gate that's closed. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I couldn't say it any better. Right.
Thank you very much.
So it's not necessarily the least cost plan, but it's kind of a trade-off between effectiveness and cost.
Right. And as I
also
mentioned,
the politics of
the fencing doesn't. That's more to prevent trespass and additional pedestrian safety measures. Don't get you any farther in terms of the quiet zone, but they make the high use, high risk areas safer for bikes and peds.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, we're going to wrap this up. Thank you very much. And before you all leave, we are going to do the consent calendar. Get one thing off of our list tonight.
All right. I move to approve the items on the consent calendar.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 8 in favor and none in opposition. It passes. Thank you all very much. See you back at 7:30.